Julius Caesar, Cleopatra, Augustus. So long ago did these rulers leave their marks on history that we can barely think of them as anything more than legend and myth. But even during their time, there were civilizations that existed so long ago they were more distant to Rome than we are today. These were the mighty nations of the Bronze Age. Before there was Caesar or Hannibal, there was Ramses the Great and Quintili II. Before there was Rome and Carthage, there were the Hittites and the mighty Kemetic Empire of Egypt. These mighty characters and empires existed not 2,000 years ago, but 4,000. The Bronze Age saw humanity reach a level of prosperity it would not see again in millennia. But then, seemingly out of nowhere, they vanished. The written word seemed to disappear off the face of the earth, and the mighty civilizations that had stood for so long crumbled to the sea. This is known as the Bronze Age collapse. But what if it never happened? What if these mighty nations of old continued to thrive beyond this apparent doomsday that came about? But before we can answer that, we must answer the question of what caused the Bronze Age collapse. And this is the most mysterious and intriguing thing about it. There are many theories as to why it happened, but it was so sudden and so thorough, not to mention how long ago it was, that we don't know what really caused it. It seems there was some sort of ecological disaster which, along with other factors, led to famine, followed by an invasion by the most likely partially mythical sea people, some sort of proto-Viking from the Mediterranean, and all of society collapsed. But today I would like to imagine a timeline where come the 1200s BCE, no great catastrophe collapses the social structures of antiquity, a world where the ancient players of the Bronze Age would continue on, a world which never ended. Come the turn of the 13th century BCE, there were many powers and peoples that dominated the eastern Mediterranean. These will come to be the main players in this scenario. Before we could discuss what would happen if there was no sudden collapse of society, let's go over a short summary of these main civilizations. First off, we have the Assyrians. The Assyrian Empire was just an upstart power in the era. Hailing from northern Mesopotamia, the Assyrians were in a state of warfare on all frontiers, fighting to overshadow the Babylonians, who had before been the foremost Mesopotamian power. Next we have the Hittites. The Hittites traced their origins to the mountains of Anatolia. Through the work of great kings, they pushed their borders to encompass almost the entire region, and would even push into Syria, where they would come into conflict with our next major power. The Egyptians had been around for thousands of years up to this point. However, they spent most of their history as an isolationist civilization, never pushing outward from the Nile River. But all this changed in the 1400s BCE, when they expanded into the Levant and began clashing with the Hittite for control over Syria. The Egyptians were undergoing a golden age of power and culture up until the Bronze Age collapse. This allowed them to be one of the only of these powers to survive the collapse, granted in a much weaker and smaller state. Lastly, we have the people who inhabited Greece, namely and mainly the Mycenaeans. The Mycenaeans were a heavily militaristic people, just like some of their descendants would be a couple hundred years later. They lived in city-states dominated by kings called Wanixes. The Mycenaeans were in the midst of their own cultural golden age when the collapse happened. This was due to their brief occupation of Crete, home to the Minoans. The mix of these two cultures led to a boom in bronzework and pottery. Although there would be no complete collapse in society and civilization like in our timeline, there would not only be winners in the coming centuries, there would be losers as well. The Hittites were one of the most influential powers of the Bronze Age world. Dominating Anatolia, they could even be considered the era's foremost power. But the tides were turning even before the Bronze Age collapse. The 1200s saw them lose several battles to the Assyrians, as well as immense political instability. Although not completely collapsing, I would imagine the Hittites would fall back out of Syria back to the highlands of Anatolia, becoming more of a trade vassal state of Egypt rather than a power of their own. as the pharaohs would dominate their trade of bronze. Speaking of the Assyrians, their own resurgence was also already looking to be short-lived at the time of the collapse. They had just burned the great city of Babylon to the ground, before being defeated by the Babylonians. For the people living in Assyria, this delegitimized the kings of Assyria. Civil discontent would become rampant enough to force a complete withdrawal from foreign expansion. Following the fall of their only rivals in the area, this would leave the Egyptians in a position to dominate the entire Levant and Middle East, dominating the bronze trade. Meanwhile, in Greece, Mycenaean and Minoan culture would further fuse into one single Greek identity, not only limited to Greece, however. This Greek culture would begin to quickly spread through the south of Italy, as the Mycenaeans established colonies on the coast and trade with Italian tribes. At this point, there was almost no trace of organized civilization in Italy, meaning a void of culture that could be filled easily by the Greeks, as the native peoples began to adopt Greek customs and religion. By the time of the 10th century BCE, there would be a clear divide between the two major cultural centers of the world. Egypt would have the entire Middle East under their boot, either directly or indirectly. The 19th dynasty would oversee a prosperous and powerful empire. On the north side of the Mediterranean, the Greeks would begin to dominate the trade of the West, creating colonies that would themselves become self-governing mercantile trading states. However, the Egyptians would not be completely left behind. Their conquest of the Levant would put the Phoenicians, a seafaring people, firmly under their influence. In our own timeline, there is evidence Egypt was beginning to expand into Libya before they completely fell in on themselves during the collapse. I could see Egyptian settlements being set up in Libya and even the Barbary coast. In Greece, the power dynamic would begin to change. As time went on, Greece proper would begin to centralize, from hundreds of little city-states into less plentiful, more powerful ones, coming to resemble classical-era Greece. After some consolidation, great powers could begin to rise out of this region, echoes of their timeline counterparts in Sparta, Athens, or Thebes. The Greeks would come into conflict with whatever was left or whoever succeeded the Hittites as they pushed further into Anatolia. In a world with 1,000 more years of continued history, Greek culture would truly have the space to take over the world. However, not the Greek we know, but an older, Mycenaean-Minoan fusion version. The Balkans, Italy, North Africa, maybe even eventually places as far off as Gaul would begin to heavily feel the Greek influence, whether through trade, colonization, or conquest. As these riches would flow back into the Greek world and their colonial mercantile states across the Mediterranean would grow in power, we would see the focus of the Bronze Age world, or more accurately at this point, the Iron Age world, but I'll get to that, would become less focused on the traditional region of the Middle East to the rest of the Mediterranean. My best guess as to what would happen next is a steady decline in Egyptian power. As bronze becomes phased out in favor of iron, their trade monopoly on bronze would become less and less important. While I doubt they would completely fall into insignificance, Egyptian civilization was just too stubborn for that, they would most likely become more of a regional power rather than a global one, perhaps pulling out of the upper Levant directly and instead heavily influencing them. This leaves the world open to the Greeks, who would have been in the right time at the right place with the right naval and cultural power to come to dominate the entire Mediterranean world. Italy, North Africa, perhaps coastal Iberia and Gaul, all becoming regions with heavy Mycenaean Greek cultural influence. It is at this point where the timeline becomes just too unpredictable to continue on. New powers would surely rise, whether it be from the old Middle Eastern world, Italy, or North Africa, but who knows what those powers would look like or who they would be, and I have no way of telling. To me, the most important thing about the Bronze Age collapse is the lesson it teaches and the warning it gives. A society heavily connected by international trade, with a complex web of different powers and governments, met with disaster that would eventually lead to a complete collapse of society. Sound familiar? Well, that's a topic for another time. For now, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.